The morning started quietly, almost as if the world was holding its breath. She walked through the crowded streets, carrying a small bag on her shoulder and a sense of quiet determination in her steps. The city was alive with noise cars honking, people talking, the soft hum of construction somewhere in the distance, but she moved through it like she existed in a bubble of her own calm. She had learned long ago how to navigate a world that rarely noticed her. The piano was waiting for her at the far corner of the square, a black upright that looked more like a piece of furniture than an instrument. People passed by without a glance, or if they looked, it was with the kind of polite indifference that comes from seeing something familiar every day. This piano had been there for months, maybe years. No one remembered exactly why it was placed there. Some said it was for tourists, some said it was an art project, and others didn't care at all. To most, it was just a place to rest a bag or a backdrop for photos. She approached it carefully. Her shoes made soft taps against the stone tiles, blending with the distant chatter of the morning crowd. Her hands itched to touch the keys, to let them speak the way words often failed her. Yet, as she reached the piano, she noticed the curious eyes of a few onlookers. Some were waiting for a friend, some were hurrying to work, and others were simply curious about the small figure standing there with an air of quiet purpose. They didn't say anything. They just stared, and she could feel the weight of their doubt. It wasn't the first time she had faced doubt. It never would be. She had learned early that people like to make judgments without knowing the whole story. They looked at her hands, small and delicate, probably thought they would never produce anything more than timid, careless notes. They noticed her simple clothes, her modest posture, and assumed she was ordinary in every way. Ordinary was a word people loved to use when they didn't understand someone. She paused for a moment, placing her bag on the ground, her fingers hovering just above the keys. She could feel their eyes on her. Some whispered to each other, a few laughed softly, and a couple of teenagers recorded her on their phones, probably to mock her later. Her heart beat faster, but not with fear. No, it was a mix of nerves and anticipation. The kind that comes before a moment you know will matter. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes briefly, imagining herself somewhere else, somewhere she had played before when there were no eyes to judge her. She remembered the first piano she ever touched, at a small music school in her neighborhood. She was a child then, timid and unsure. But the moment her fingers pressed down on the keys, the sound spoke to her in a way no one else could. It was the first time she understood that music could be more than notes. It could be life itself. Opening her eyes, she looked around at the crowd again. They were still waiting, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. One man leaned against a lamppost with his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. A woman nearby shook her head as if to say, "Why bother?" Even a small child peered from behind a parent, wide-eyed but unsure what to expect. And yet, all of these people would become part of her story, even if they didn't realize it yet. Her fingers finally touched the keys, brushing lightly, almost testing the waters. The sound was soft, almost hesitant, like a whisper that asked permission to exist. The crowd murmured at the small noise. Some glanced around, waiting for a pause for the moment to end and confirm their assumptions. But she didn't stop. She let the next note flow, then the next, each one carrying more confidence than the last. The sound began to stretch out, filling the square in subtle waves, gentle at first, then gradually stronger. She didn't play for them. Not yet. She played for herself, for the years of practice in empty rooms, for the quiet nights when no one was listening, and for the tiny victories that had felt monumental at the time. She played for the moments when she had been overlooked in life, for the times she had been told she wasn't enough. Each note held a memory, each chord a small story. And as she played, something shifted. She felt the presence of the crowd, yes, but not in a threatening way. Instead, it became a mirror, reflecting the space she was claiming, showing her that she could exist fully. Even here, even now, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the papers of a nearby street vendor and fluttering the edges of a notebook left open on the piano's ledge. She didn't notice. Her eyes were fixed on the keys, her hands moving with a familiarity born of years of devotion. The sound started to gather a kind of momentum, a quiet strength that seemed to surprise even her. She smiled slightly, though the crowd might not have seen it, and pressed forward. A few people started to lean in, curious now in a way that was different from before. The man leaning on the lamppost uncrossed his arms, the smirk fading as he watched her fingers move. The woman who had shaken her head earlier paused mid-step, drawn in by the clarity and beauty of the sounds. Even the child's wide eyes seemed to fixate on her, absorbing the gentle power in each note. For the first time, the piano was not background anymore. It was a voice, a statement, and it was hers. The notes she played weren't complicated or flashy. There were no dramatic leaps, no showy flourishes meant to impress. Instead, they were honest, clear, and intentional. Each one felt like a word spoken quietly but with purpose. Each chord was a breath, steady and human, a reminder that even in a noisy, distracted world, quiet strength could make itself heard. Time seemed to stretch. A few more passers-by stopped, uncertain but intrigued. Conversations faded. The pigeons that had scattered at the beginning of her performance returned, hopping closer as if drawn by the music. She didn't notice the little things. She only noticed the feeling inside her, the connection she was forging, not with the crowd, but with herself. There was a memory that floated to the surface of her first recital at the small music school. She had trembled then too, standing in front of an audience of strangers. She remembered the shame she had felt when her hands slipped on a note, and how the applause at the end had been both relief and affirmation. She remembered the teacher's gentle voice saying, "You have to feel the music before it can feel others." She realized now that those words had never left her. They were alive in her fingers, in her posture, in the way she let the piano speak. A few people in the crowd began to shift. They looked at each other, unsure, and then back at her. Whispers began again, but this time there was a difference. The tone was not mocking. It was curious, questioning. "She's actually good," someone murmured. Another nodded, lips pressed together as if to say, "I didn't expect that." She could feel the change, subtle but unmistakable. Even if she didn't let it distract her, the sounds she produced were soft but deliberate. She played slowly now, savoring each note, letting it linger in the air. The square, usually full of noise, felt like it had been wrapped in a quiet blanket, all sound bending toward her. She could hear her own breathing, steady and calm, matching the rhythm she created with her hands. In a way, the crowd had become part of her composition. Their presence, their doubt, their attention, all mixed into the music like an unseen harmony. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. The moment existed in itself, and she existed fully in it. She could see small gestures of change around her heads turning. People standing still where they would normally walk past, eyes following her hands as if trying to learn something from them. The piano had become more than wooden strings. It had become a bridge between her world and theirs, a place where doubt could be left behind without a word spoken by now. Even the most skeptical members of the crowd had stopped their murmuring. Phones were lowered, laughter disappeared, and the ambient noise of the city faded into the background. She could feel the shift in energy, not because she had demanded it, because she had allowed herself to exist fully in the moment. Music, she thought, has a way of doing that. It doesn't ask permission, but it finds a way in. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She remembered the long journey that had brought her here, the years of lessons, the countless moments of self-doubt, the days when she thought no one would ever care. She had waited for a moment like this, though she didn't know it at the time, and now, sitting at a piano in a busy square, she understood that those moments had all led her here, to a place where she could speak without words and be heard without demand. And so she continued. Each note a small declaration of presence, each chord a quiet rebellion against the assumptions of strangers. The world around her might still be skeptical, still filled with people who judged before they understood, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't care. The music was enough. The music was her voice. The moment after her first notes lingered in the square. She felt a shift, but it wasn't complete yet. The crowd's skepticism had softened, but it had not disappeared. Some people still lingered on the edges, arms crossed, waiting for the next mistake, waiting for the spell to break. She knew this feeling well. Pause between being noticed and being truly understood. That pause was always the hardest. She glanced briefly at the onlookers. Faces that had once shown curiosity now showed mild surprise, and a few even showed faint admiration. There was a man leaning on a pillar, squinting as if he could not believe what his ears were hearing. A woman nearby adjusted her scarf and tilted her head slightly, unsure whether she should continue watching or dismiss the moment as something insignificant. Even the child who had peeked from behind the mother's skirt now took a step forward. Eyes wide and fixed on the piano, her fingers hovered above the keys again, not in hesitation, but in anticipation. She could feel the weight of the audience's expectations pressing down without them even trying. She didn't want to prove them wrong, at least not in the way they expected. She wanted them to feel what she felt when music flowed through her, how it could carry hope, sadness, joy, or quiet strength. She wanted them to understand, without a single word, that music could speak in ways nothing else could. She pressed the first key of her next sequence, and a small, deliberate note rose into the air. Then another. Slowly, carefully, she built a melody that was intimate and human. It didn't need to fill the entire square. It only needed to touch those who were listening. She thought about the lessons she had learned over the years, not just about technique, but about feeling. About understanding that a note played perfectly but without heart was empty. The heart was what mattered, and she let hers guide her hands. The crowd began to shift again. Some people took a step closer, drawn by the way the music seemed to vibrate through the air. Others stopped mid-step, their attention caught by the emotion embedded in the notes. A few whispered to each other, unable to keep their thoughts silent. "She's different," one said quietly. Another nodded slowly, lips pressed together, eyes fixed on her hands. Even the man who had leaned on the pillar smirked faintly at first, but now his expression softened. He was listening, really listening for the first time. Her mind drifted briefly to her own story. She remembered the countless hours spent alone with the piano at home, the evenings when she thought no one would ever hear her play. She remembered the small victories perfecting a difficult chord, capturing the right emotion in a difficult piece, and the disappointments that followed when no one noticed. Every struggle had taught her patience. Every failure had taught her resilience. And every quiet moment of practice had shaped the way she played now, as she continued. She felt a rhythm growing beneath her fingers, a pulse that connected her to the world around her. The sounds of the city faded further, replaced by the music she created. For a moment, it felt like she was the only person there, alone with the piano, and yet completely connected to everyone around her. Music, she realized, could make that possible. It could bridge distance, dissolve judgment, and create a shared experience even among strangers. The man with the crossed arms finally uncrossed them. He leaned slightly forward, his eyes tracking each movement of her fingers. A woman nearby pulled out a small notebook and scribbled a few lines. Though whether it was to remember the melody or simply to capture the moment, no one could tell. The child now sat down on the curb, legs crossed, completely absorbed. The whispers of doubt that had filled the air earlier were replaced by murmurs of wonder. Something was happening, something subtle but undeniable. She pressed a chord a little harder this time, letting it resonate in the square. The sound carried over the heads of the people near the back, reaching ears that had not yet noticed her. One elderly man paused in the middle of his morning walk. He looked down at the piano, at her small figure, and then back at the keys. For a long moment, he didn't move. He just listened. The music seemed to touch something inside him, something he had almost forgotten. She felt her own emotions swell as she played. It was not just technical skill she wanted to show. It was life itself, reflected in sound. She thought of the people who had doubted her in the past, teachers, classmates, strangers on the street, and imagined that maybe they could understand now. Not through words, but through the truth in each note. Her heart guided her fingers, and the piano responded as if it understood exactly what she meant. The square, usually noisy and chaotic, felt transformed. Each note seemed to settle the crowd, weaving a calm that was almost tangible. People stopped scrolling through their phones. Conversations paused. Even the street vendors seemed to lean in slightly, listening to something they hadn't expected to hear. The music was doing something subtle, but powerful. It was demanding attention. Not through force, but through honesty. She noticed how small gestures of change began to appear. A man in a suit stopped tapping his foot impatiently, and instead closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. A woman with shopping bags tilted her head, as if trying to understand how something so ordinary-looking could produce something so extraordinary. Even the child leaned forward, hands resting on the knees, completely absorbed. She realized that while she hadn't intended to impress anyone, the music was reaching people in ways words never could. Her mind wandered to the idea of courage. She had needed courage to sit at this piano in a crowded square, to play while the eyes of strangers weighed on her. She had needed courage every time she practiced alone, hoping that someday someone might listen. And now, in this moment, courage was not just about facing the crowd. It was about being vulnerable, about putting a piece of herself into the air where anyone could hear it. That vulnerability, she realized, is what made the music alive. The melody grew slightly stronger, still gentle, but more assured. It moved like a river, flowing from one chord to another, carrying the emotion she had kept hidden for so long. People who had doubted her began to shift, leaning closer, their expressions softening. The man with the smirk now looked genuinely impressed. A young woman whispered something to her friend, though no one else could hear. The sound of the piano had created a quiet, shared understanding among strangers. She paused for a moment, letting a note linger, almost like a question suspended in the air. The crowd held their breath. Even the birds nearby seemed to still their movements, attentive to the music. It was a rare kind of silence, one that comes not from absence, but from full presence. She could feel it, a delicate energy connecting her to the people watching. The music had become a bridge, and every note she played strengthened it. Her thoughts drifted again, this time to the people who had encouraged her quietly over the years. Not the ones who clapped and praised loudly, but those who had believed in her when no one else would. Her parents, who had noticed her love for music when she was a child. Her music teacher, who had patiently corrected her mistakes and taught her to feel the notes rather than just play them. Even the friends who had sat with her late at night, listening while she practiced pieces over and over. They had all contributed to this moment. The melody took on a deeper, more resonant tone. She let her fingers explore the keys, not in a rush, but with intention. Each movement was deliberate, each note chosen carefully. The crowd seemed to lean in further, sensing the shift in emotion. There was a subtle tension in the air now, a quiet anticipation that something significant was unfolding. They had moved from doubt to curiosity, and now, perhaps to wonder. A small smile appeared on her face. She noticed the little things, the way a man's brow lifted in surprise. The woman in the corner holding a cup of coffee, still watching with rapt attention. The child who had forgotten about toys or distractions, entirely absorbed in the music. These were the moments she had played for all her life, the moments when connection transcended words. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It had become a voice that carried emotion and truth. She thought about how strange life could be. Just moments ago, she had been a figure on the edge of notice, dismissed by many. Now, without a single word, without anything dramatic, she had captured attention, hearts, and respect. The idea was both humbling and empowering. She realized that sometimes the quietest voices have the most profound impact when they are finally heard. Her melody continued to evolve. It was no longer tentative. It flowed with confidence, shaped by her experience and emotion. She could feel the energy of the square shifting around her. The sounds of footsteps, distant traffic, soft chatter faded into the background, replaced entirely by the presence of music and the attention it demanded. People were no longer just watching. They were participating in a shared experience they could not ignore, and as she played, she understood something she had known all along, but never fully appreciated until now. Music could carry truth in a way nothing else could. It could bypass judgment, dissolve skepticism, and reach the heart directly. The crowd's doubt, once heavy and palpable, now felt distant, replaced by curiosity and wonder. Each note she played chipped away at the assumptions. slowly revealing the person beneath the quiet exterior, the talent that had been underestimated for too long. The music she played now carried a confidence she had never felt so strongly before. Her fingers moved over the keys with a smooth certainty, each note purposeful, each chord deliberate. The square, once noisy and bustling, seemed to bend itself around her melody. Conversations ceased. Footsteps slowed. Even the wind, which had been teasing leaves and papers nearby, now whispered softly, almost as if listening. The people who had been skeptical, impatient, or dismissive before were no longer standing at the edges. They were leaning in, drawn to the sound, caught in a moment that none of them expected. The child who had been sitting on the curb now rested their chin in their hands, wide-eyed, trying to process what was happening. They were not the only one. Adults, who had initially been unimpressed, were now staring in quiet amazement. One man, who had earlier shrugged and looked away, now leaned forward slightly, squinting as he tried to understand the subtle depth in the notes. Even the woman with the notebook, who had begun jotting down something almost absent-mindedly, now paused mid-scribble and simply watched. Letting the melody sink in, she allowed the music to grow, letting it fill the space, not just with sound, but with emotion. She thought about all the moments that had led her here, the years of practice, the nights spent alone with nothing but a lamp and her piano, the times she had been told she would never amount to anything. Every struggle, every disappointment, every quiet triumph now wove itself into her playing. It was not just skill that she was showing, it was life itself, laid bare, flowing through her fingers. For the first time that morning, she felt a sense of liberation. This was no longer about proving herself to anyone. This was about expressing the fullness of her experience, about letting music speak the things words never could. And as she played, she noticed the crowd beginning to transform. Their expressions softened, their shoulders relaxed. There was an unspoken connection forming, a bond that did not need introductions or explanations. The music was speaking directly to them, bypassing doubt, skepticism, judgment. She glanced briefly at the man who had been leaning against the pillar all morning. He now looked genuinely intrigued, his eyes following her hands as if he could learn something from the way she moved. A few others whispered among themselves, though quietly, as if they didn't want to break the spell. The city's usual noise, the hum of traffic, distant sirens, the chatter of people had faded into a background hum. Secondary to the music that now dominated the square, her thoughts drifted to her first experiences playing for an audience. Not in grand concert halls, but in small, intimate gatherings, where even one listener mattered. She remembered the nervous energy, the tiny tremble in her hands, and the relief when someone's eyes lit up in appreciation. Back then, she had learned that connection was more powerful than applause. One person's understanding could outweigh 1,000 indifferent stares. And now, standing in the middle of a busy square, she felt that connection multiplied across dozens of strangers, each silently participating in her music. The melody shifted slightly, growing more complex without losing its intimacy. She played with subtle dynamics, letting some notes linger longer while others fell away gently. The crowd responded without words. A woman with a stroller paused mid-step, listening as her child turned toward the piano, captivated. A man on a nearby bench leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, his expression softening as he absorbed the sound. Even the birds who had been darting around the square now perched nearby, still and attentive. She could feel the energy of the crowd rising, though it was not the frantic energy of excitement or surprise. It was a calm, attentive energy, a presence that seemed to hold its breath with her. She let the music take her where it wanted, allowing each phrase to unfold naturally. There was a subtle joy in this freedom, a release she had not realized she had been longing for. The piano was no longer an object, no longer a tool. It had become an extension of herself, a vessel through which she could share her story. Her fingers moved faster now, but not recklessly. The notes flowed in a way that seemed effortless, though she knew every movement was deliberate. She remembered the countless hours of practice, the repetition of scales, the correction of mistakes, and the patience required to perfect even the simplest passages. All of it came together in this moment. Each lesson, and each struggle visible in the strength and emotion behind every note. The crowd's reaction continued to evolve. Faces that had been skeptical were now fully absorbed. People whispered to each other in amazement, sharing quiet acknowledgments of something they could not put into words. A young couple standing near the edge of the square held hands instinctively, feeling the emotion that floated from the piano. Even the older man who had seemed detached earlier now sat up straighter, eyes glistening as he listened, letting himself be moved. She paused for a single note, letting it resonate and fade slowly. The silence afterward was profound, not awkward or empty, but filled with anticipation. The crowd held its breath, collectively aware that something remarkable was unfolding. It was a quiet tension, the kind that comes when people realize they are witnessing something beyond ordinary experience. She felt it too, a deep awareness of the moment's significance, though she did not let it distract her. She simply continued, letting the music lead the way. The melody began to weave in gentle variations, subtle shifts in rhythm and tone that added layers of depth. She drew on her memories, her experiences, her emotions, letting them guide each choice. She thought of the people who had doubted her, the moments when she had felt overlooked or underestimated, and she allowed those feelings to transform into sound. The music became a reflection of her journey, a story without words. Unfolding in front of strangers who were now witnesses to her truth, she noticed small gestures of connection in the crowd. A man sitting on a bench had closed his eyes, swaying slightly in time with the music. A woman adjusted her scarf and smiled faintly, moved by the emotion in the notes. The child on the curb leaned forward even more, eyes wide, completely absorbed. Even the street vendors paused in their work, listening quietly as the music carried through the square. The piano had become more than an instrument. It had become a shared language, one that transcended age, background, and expectation. Her hands moved with increasing confidence. She allowed herself to explore the higher registers, letting the notes ring out clearly, while her left hand provided a steady, grounding rhythm. The combination created a sense of movement, of ebb and flow, that seemed to draw the listeners in deeper. The square, once chaotic and noisy, had become a theater of emotion, a place where every sound carried significance and every pause invited reflection as she played. She remembered the first time she had truly understood the power of music. She had been a child then, playing in a small recital, terrified and uncertain. One person in the audience had listened with full attention, eyes soft, face open, absorbing every note. That single act of recognition had changed her, made her realize that music could reach people in ways words could not. Now, years later, she was witnessing that realization multiplied across dozens of strangers, each silently acknowledging the truth of her music. Her mind wandered briefly to the concept of courage. Courage had brought her here, to this piano, to this moment in front of a crowd of strangers. But it was not the kind of courage that demanded recognition or applause. It was the courage to be vulnerable, to let her emotions flow openly, and to trust that the world could respond with understanding rather than judgment. And the world was responding. Slowly, gently, beautifully, the notes became richer, more resonant. She allowed herself to feel the music fully, letting her emotions guide her hands. Each chord carried a piece of her history, each phrase a fragment of her soul. The crowd, sensing this authenticity, leaned in further, caught in a shared experience that neither they nor she could have anticipated. The music was no longer just sound, it was a story unfolding in real time. And everyone present was part of it. She felt a quiet thrill as she played. The transformation in the crowd was undeniable. Skepticism had shifted to curiosity, curiosity to wonder, and now a subtle reverence had begun to emerge. People who had laughed or whispered before now watched silently, fully present, their attention a testament to the power of what she was sharing. It was a reminder that the world could surprise you, that moments of genuine connection could happen in the most unexpected places. Her fingers danced across the keys, it flowing naturally from one phrase to the next. She thought of the times she had been told she wasn't good enough, the moments she had been overlooked, and the quiet determination that had kept her practicing day after day, year after year. All of it had led to this moment, a culmination of persistence, passion, and a willingness to show up even when the world doubted her. The music reached a crescendo, gentle yet powerful, filling the square with a resonance that seemed almost alive. She let each note linger, creating a sense of tension and release that drew the listeners deeper into the experience. The crowd was completely absorbed now, moved not by spectacle, but by authenticity, by the honesty embedded in every sound. They were witnessing something rare, a performer completely in touch with herself and her music, and a moment that could not be recreated. As she continued, she realized that the music was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone present, a shared experience that united strangers in silent understanding. The child, the man on the bench, the woman with the scarf, the street vendors, they were all part of the same moment, connected by the resonance of her playing. And in that connection, she found something profound. The simple, human truth that music, when played with heart, could bridge any gap. The music had grown in depth and presence, filling every corner of the square. She could feel it not just under her fingers, but in the air around her, vibrating in the pavement, brushing against the faces of the people who had gathered. Something had changed. The crowd was no longer just a collection of curious strangers. They were part of the moment. Each person seemed to lean in closer, as if drawn by an invisible thread, connected not just to her music, but to the story she was telling without words. Her hands moved across the keys with precision and grace. But it was the emotion behind each note that held the square captive. She thought about the years of struggle it had taken to reach this point. The endless practice sessions when no one was listening, the times she had doubted herself. All of it came together now, not as a display of skill, but as an honest sharing of herself. She was not performing for applause. She was performing because she could not help herself. She had to speak through music, and now the world was listening. People around her began to shift subtly. A man who had been impatient earlier, fidgeting with his phone, now leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on her hands. A woman carrying grocery bags paused mid-step, looking over her shoulder to watch, a small smile forming as she let the notes wash over her. The child on the curb now had their mouths slightly open, completely absorbed, fingers clutching their knees as if holding on to the moment. Even birds perched nearby seemed to stay still. Captivated by the sound that floated like a delicate thread through the morning air, she let herself feel the music fully, allowing it to carry her emotions outward. Each chord resonated with the stories she carried inside, the quiet loneliness, the small victories, the moments when she had been overlooked. She poured them into the keys, letting the audience feel the weight of her journey without a single word. Music, she knew, could communicate what words often failed to express. And now the crowd was feeling it. Whether they realized it or not, the melody shifted again, becoming more complex, more layered, more alive. Her left hand provided a steady, grounding rhythm, while her right hand danced over the higher keys, creating delicate, intertwining patterns. She could feel the anticipation building in the crowd, a quiet energy that made the space feel alive. It was no longer just a performance. It was a shared experience, something ephemeral and beautiful that existed only in that moment, yet would leave a lasting mark on everyone who witnessed it. She glanced briefly at the crowd, noticing the subtle changes in expression. The man leaning on the bench now had a soft look in his eyes, something like awe, mixed with recognition. The woman with the grocery bags had set them down, forgotten in the moment, as if nothing else mattered. The child had leaned forward, resting their chin on their hands, completely absorbed, eyes wide with wonder. Even the casual passers-by, who had stopped just out of curiosity now, seemed drawn in. Sensing that something extraordinary was happening, her mind wandered briefly to the small victories that had led her here. The first time she had learned a difficult piece, the moment her teacher had nodded with approval, the quiet encouragement from her parents, and the late nights when she had practiced alone in the dark. Every one of those moments had been a step toward this day. A day when her music could touch strangers in a way she had only dreamed of. And now, as she played, she realized that those dreams were unfolding in real time. Unfolding in a square filled with people who had once doubted her, the music grew richer, more resonant, and the crowd responded instinctively. A hush fell over the square, not forced, not artificial, but a silence born from collective attention. People stopped talking, stopped moving, stopped thinking about anything other than the music that flowed from her hands. It was a rare kind of silence, one that carried its own weight, one that made the world feel as though it had paused. Just for this moment, she allowed a few notes to linger, stretching them into the air, letting them resonate and fade slowly. The effect was immediate. Faces softened, shoulders relaxed. Even those who had been skeptical or dismissive now looked with quiet respect, their expressions betraying the emotional impact of what they were hearing. A young man whispered to his companion, though no one else could hear, words lost in the beauty of the melody, but the meaning clear. He had been moved. Her hands moved faster now, but with deliberate control. The melody built and receded, creating waves of sound that carried a story through the air. She was no longer thinking about technique, or about the crowd, or even about herself. She was thinking only about the music, about the truth she wanted to convey, and about the way the world seemed to open itself to her in response. Each note was a heartbeat, chord a pulse that connected her to the people listening. The transformation in the crowd was becoming undeniable. People who had been restless or distracted now stood still, leaning slightly forward, drawn into the sound. Some had closed their eyes, letting themselves be fully immersed. Others looked around at one another, sharing unspoken acknowledgement of the beauty unfolding before them. The street vendors, who had been busy with their morning routines, paused and listened, their hands idle for the first time that day. The square had been transformed from a busy, ordinary space into a place of shared wonder. She felt the emotions swell within her as she continued. She thought about the courage it had taken to sit at this piano that morning, knowing that people might laugh or dismiss her. She thought about the vulnerability required to pour herself into music in front of strangers, to lay bare her emotions without any guarantee of understanding or appreciation. And yet here she was, and the world was responding not with words, but with the silent recognition that what she was giving was real, honest, and deeply human. Her fingers danced over the keys with renewed purpose. She allowed herself to explore the full range of the instrument, moving from soft, tender passages to fuller, more resonant chords that filled the square. Each note carried layers of meaning, echoing the quiet triumphs and struggles of her life. The crowd was completely absorbed, leaning in with each shift in melody, hanging on to every subtle change in tone. Even the wind seemed too quiet, as though it too were listening. As though the entire world had conspired to create this perfect moment. She noticed how small gestures began to spread through the crowd. A man lifted his head, eyes glistening, a faint smile forming at the corners of his lips. A woman in the back reached out instinctively to steady her stroller, though her attention never wavered from the piano. The child on the curb had forgotten about toys, forgotten about the people around them, completely absorbed in the music. Even those who had stopped only out of curiosity were now witnessing something extraordinary, something that touched them in ways they could not articulate. She let herself feel the intensity of the moment. She thought about the years she had been underestimated, about the people who had dismissed her quietly, about the long days of practice that had felt endless at the time. All of it had led to this moment, and she allowed herself to be fully present, fully human, fully alive in the music. Each note was an act of honesty, each chord a testament to persistence and courage. The audience could feel it. She could see it in their faces, in their posture, in the way they leaned into the sound as if it were a lifeline. The music became more intricate, moving like a river through the square. There were moments of quiet reflection where her hands barely touched the keys, allowing the notes to hang in the air. And then, just as suddenly, the melody would surge, rising and falling with a power that seemed to resonate in the bones of the listeners. She was no longer just playing. She was storytelling, using sound to convey the human experience in its entirety, its struggles, its joys, its quiet triumphs, and its profound beauty. A hush fell again, deeper than before. The square, normally filled with noise and chaos, was now a space of stillness, all attention fixed on the piano. She could feel the collective energy of the crowd, the way it responded to her every move, the way it seemed to bend and shift in harmony with the music. It was not forced, not staged. It was real, organic, alive. And in that moment, she understood that she had given them something rare, a glimpse of truth expressed through art. The notes swirled and danced, moving from soft, delicate passages to bold, resonant chords that carried a sense of triumph. She could see the faces of the crowd reacting, some eyes closed, some wide with awe, some glistening with tears. The music was reaching people in ways that words could not, speaking directly to the heart. She had never played like this before, fully aware that every note mattered, that every pause carried meaning, that the energy of the square was now entwined with her own.